Harold Sasko, better known as Hal, lived in Kansas City. He was born on September 11, 1961, in Tidosville, Florida, and was one of 12 children in the family. His siblings described Harold as a person who was ready to take responsibility in almost any situation. He often helped his brothers and sisters with household chores and was generally very organized. So, it was not surprising that after graduating from college, Hal opened his own pizzeria, and just 2 years later, he expanded his business by starting a second restaurant. This led to his move to Lawrence in late 1990 with his then-wife, Anna, and their 3-year-old daughter, Mendez. Not far away, in the city of Topeka, Hal opened a third restaurant. Harold became dependent on his business, and his hard work and lifestyle focused solely on work did not suit his wife. After all, Hal was not only a business owner but also a husband and father, so his wife and child deserved his attention. Eventually, this led to a serious rift between the couple, and when his wife could no longer endure the lonely life, they decided to divorce. Hal was considered a church parishioner, and he was proud of being not only a man of God but also a respected member of the community. Those around him knew him as a kind, caring, and extremely organized manager, so it came as a real shock to the community when, on January 17, 2014, their so-called good and caring manager suddenly disappeared. The day began like any other Friday. The weekend was just around the corner, and many people went to work to carry out their daily duties. Of course, this day was no exception for the pizza employees. The problem was that when they arrived at work, they found themselves in a quiet and empty restaurant. Usually, Hal was there to unlock the kitchen, but this time he was nowhere to be seen. Even stranger was the fact that it had been several days since anyone had heard from him. Concerned about his well-being, the employees called the police and demanded a welfare check at his home on West 26th Street. Later that day, a police officer was sent to his residence. When he knocked on the front door, he was met with silence. When he knocked on the front window of the house, he also received no response. The officer then looked inside to see if anyone was home, and it was at that moment that he saw the figure of a man lying face down on the floor. Calling for backup, law enforcement officials burst into the house. It was confirmed that the man on the floor was Hal, and moreover, he was lying in a pool of his own blood. It immediately became apparent that he was already dead, and judging by the condition of his body, he had been dead for several days. Moreover, it was not an accident. His hands were tied behind his back with zip ties, which were used to keep him under control. Hal's legs were also tied, but the most horrifying detail was that his throat was cut so deeply that the wound was shattered. With such a serious and brutal wound, he had no chance of surviving. The officers were faced with an extremely gruesome scene. To top it all off, the police found several empty bottles at the other end of the room, as well as a phone and laptop that did not belong to Hal. They also noticed the absence of Hal's car in the driveway. But the strangest piece of evidence left at the crime scene was the word freedom, sloppily written on the wall in Harold's blood. The sudden influx of officers in the area undoubtedly drew increased attention from curious neighbors. The police decided to use this to their advantage and began asking more questions. That's how they learned that Harold was not living alone. His neighbors claimed that he was living with a girl he called his stepdaughter. This information turned out to be very important for the officers. Now they knew that there was a person who not only knew Harold well and was in constant contact with him but was also present at the crime scene. Eventually, it was established that the so-called stepdaughter was 18-year-old Sarah Gonzalez, who had been living with him for the last 2 years of his life. However, a problem arose. Sarah was nowhere to be found. This, of course. Greatly concerned, the officers found that locating Sarah became a top priority for law enforcement, as they had no idea what exactly had happened to her. She could have been abducted, become a victim, a witness, a suspect, or perhaps none of the above. In any case, it was now absolutely necessary to find her. Family members and friends were informed about this horrific crime, and 3 weeks later, on February 8th, a funeral was planned in memory of the lost community member. The public was urged to contact Douglas County forensic investigators and provide any information about Sarah's whereabouts. A reward of $1,000 was announced for any useful information. Sarah Gonzalez Milam was born on July 9, 1994, in Kansas. She grew up in a loving family of 5. She had a brother and a sister. Throughout her childhood, Sarah was known as a shy but kind child. Since she was homeschooled for many years, she had few friends outside her neighborhood. However, this does not mean that she had a bad upbringing. Her parents were wonderful people, and she was always close to her sister. Unfortunately, when Sarah was a teenager, her parents eventually decided to divorce, which significantly affected her at such a vulnerable age. After her parents' divorce, her childhood and adolescence unfortunately only worsened. Sarah was quite naive, having been sheltered from the outside world by her parents, and unfortunately, people who are ready to take advantage of such a situation are always around. After her parents' divorce, Sarah experienced inappropriate behavior from a neighbor, and unfortunately, he eventually abused her. This event greatly influenced Sarah's character and behavior. She began to act completely differently than before. Much to her mother's dismay, Sarah began sneaking out of the house at night and hanging out with the wrong crowd. Even worse, this led to her frequent use of illicit substances and alcohol to drown out her suffering. It seemed that after her parents' divorce, Sarah no longer wanted to stay in her family home. That's when the pizzeria hired her. At first, Hal seemed like an ordinary kind manager, but there were rumors among the staff that he was not quite what he appeared to be. For example, Hal told all the restaurant managers that they could only hire young, attractive women. While working at the pizzeria, Sarah would wake up, go to work, spend time there, and eventually return home to her family. She often spent nights drinking before returning home. According to some reports, she was only sober at work, if you could call it that. Despite the fact that she often came in drunk and nearly got fired several times over those few months, she somehow managed to keep her job. That's because Hal seemed to feel sorry for her. He knew that she was vulnerable and needed extra support. She tragically experienced another traumatic event. One such evening, another man attacked her, and to top it all off, this scumbag even burned her with cigarettes. After that, Sarah's already fragile mental health completely crumbled. She stopped going to work, lost friends, and sank into a very dark state. Then she attempted to take her own life. Fortunately, Sarah's family found her in time to call an ambulance. She fully recovered, but it was only after the girl spent 5 months in the hospital. The nicest thing was that after being discharged from the hospital, Sarah received support from loved ones and friends. However, one of these messages of support stood out in particular. It was from her former boss, Hal. After her tragic ordeal, Hal offered to become her personal life coach or even a kind of guardian. He could pick her up, take her somewhere to eat, and even let her express everything that was on her mind. Since there was no one else to turn to, Sarah eventually enlisted his support. It was during one of these walks that she told him her entire story, including her tragic encounters with other men, drinking, and everything else. Now Hal knew that she wanted to leave her family home, and upon learning about the traumas she had, after experiencing abuse, he suggested that she live with him in his own house. It all seemed a bit dubious. The problem was that Sarah was vulnerable, lost, and hurt. Hal's offer gave her a way out of it all. After moving in with Hal, everything seemed to stabilize for a short time. She found a new job far away from the pizzeria. Hal took great care of her, she moved in with him, and she even considered college. However, Sarah's mother was unhappy with the whole situation. She found Hal quite strange, and the entire story seemed very suspicious to her. Every time she tried to talk to Sarah about it, it always ended in a big fight, which, of course, further alienated her daughter. Michelle didn't believe that Hal's intentions were always as innocent as he made them out to be. Even worse, she believed that her daughter was most likely too naive and prone to illusions to realize it. After the divorce, Sarah's father broke off all contact, and now she was trying to fill the void that had formed. To make the situation even more eerie, Hal eventually asked Sarah to call him Dad, and then he told all the neighbors that she was his stepdaughter. It's not surprising that Sarah's colleagues eventually found out about all this and inquired about her relationship with Hal. Now, when asked about it, Sarah insisted that he was just her friend and nothing more. But from an outsider's perspective, it was strange that a 50-year-old man brought an attractive but troubled 18-year-old girl into his home. Perhaps her peers suspected something. As soon as Sarah settled into the house and began to feel more comfortable, Hal started setting his own boundaries and attitudes towards life, especially when she turned 18. This change was quite alarming. Hal began buying her illegal drugs and alcohol, joking about them dating, and even brought up the topic of a sexual relationship with Sarah. In addition to these changes, he openly kept track of everything he bought for her, including alcohol, illegal drugs, cosmetics, and rent. He wanted her to feel indebted to him, and he also told her that she would only be able to leave once she paid him back. In fact, she felt so trapped that after she turned 18, she gave in to his advances, and her relationship with the man she once called Dad now became sexual. This diabolical situation lasted for a whole 10 months, and according to Sarah, they had sex several times a week. The only way she could cope was to drink and use illegal substances until she no longer felt involved in the situation. This, of course, further increased her debt to the man who was now using her body. On top of everything, Hal berated Sarah just as often as he complimented her. For example, he criticized her nose and then offered to pay for plastic surgery, which she, and sure of herself, eventually agreed to. It was clear that Hal treated her as his personal property rather than as another human being with feelings. He also paid for her gum implantation, and his next goal was to buy her breast implants. Both of these surgeries cost $16,000, which, of course, was added to the bill, and she had to pay him back when she could afford it. She found herself trapped with no way out. In addition to this, Hal also threatened Sarah, telling her that he had connections if she ever tried to escape. From that moment on, her mental health deteriorated even further. In response, she was given antidepressants to cope with the situation, for which she would eventually have to pay again. Trapped by the mental trauma of abuse and depression, Sarah's mind became clouded. She repeatedly found herself on the brink, and now, after supposedly finding someone she could rely on, he turned out to be an abuser. Sarah had absolutely had enough, and she began to act in a way that eventually turned the victim into a killer. After visiting a pet store, she bought a rabbit and signed a waiver before taking it home. That same evening, one of Hal's pizzeria managers was visiting the house for dinner and drinks. The manager was shocked when he opened the refrigerator and saw a rabbit carcass instead of beer. Sarah not only admitted that she was responsible for killing the pet rabbit but also stated that it was not the first animal she had killed. Completely bewildered by the situation, the manager politely stayed for dinner but then went home. This was a huge red flag and an indication of what Sarah was potentially capable of. Unfortunately, this sign was ignored. The main question remained whether Sarah was truly capable of killing a person. Although Sarah was initially considered missing, it was soon established that she was actually the prime suspect. Unfortunately, the detectives were not mistaken in their assumptions. They suspected that she had packed all her belongings, taken the dog, stolen Hal's car, and fled to Texas. However, along the way, she changed her plans and headed to Florida. It was warmer there, and the idea of admiring the ocean view seemed pleasant. Given this newly received information, she was officially declared a wanted person. Sarah was not only wanted on suspicion of murdering Hal but also as mentally unwell and possibly dangerous to others. Her name was on the lips of many officers across the country, and this continued for 11 days. On January 25, 2014, after being on the run for just over a week and a half, Sarah Mlan was finally found and arrested in Everglades National Park. Not surprisingly, the police officer found her in Hal's stolen car, sleeping next to a loaded gun. They also found $2,400 in cash, 2 more guns, an axe, and a couple of knives, one of which was stained with Hal's blood. A few hours after her arrest, a 3-hour interrogation began during which Sarah confessed to killing the man. According to her version of events, the story unfolded as follows. On January 14, 2014, Hal returned home after a long day at work. The sound system had recently broken down, and he decided to devote the evening to repairing it. He asked Sarah to bring him a beer, and then another, and another. After a few hours, fatigue took its toll, and Hal suddenly passed out on the floor. He didn't even suspect that Sarah had actually put a large amount of sleeping pills in one of his last bottles. By that point, she had already decided Hal had to die. She tied him up with zip ties, took a knife, and then, a few minutes later, slit his throat. Shortly after that, Hal died in his sleep. Sarah then took a shower, listening to her favorite music, and washed all the blood off herself. After that, she called work to say that she would be out for a few days because, unfortunately, a relative had passed away. She then packed her things, including a photo of her sister, took the dog, and disappeared into the night in Hal's stolen car. To avoid being found, she left her cell phone and laptop at home. During the interrogation, Sarah openly shared her motives. She felt locked in the house and indebted to a man who clearly wanted to possess her. She became his target, was abused, and then turned into his property. Anger clouded her thirst for revenge, and regardless of the consequences, revenge was exactly what she wanted. Sarah also expressed a strong desire to resort to violence. She admitted to killing animals out of curiosity. She also claimed that for 2 years, she had thoughts of violence and noticed that they were progressing. Obviously, Sarah's confession put her in a very difficult position. She not only confessed to killing Hal but also to enduring violence. Given these horrific facts, it became absolutely clear that she would face trial. However, it was also clear that Sarah was undoubtedly mentally unwell, so first and foremost, she would have to undergo a psychological examination. In addition to her recently developed penchant for violence, she also claimed to have memory lapses and felt that she was an observer in her own mind. Not surprisingly, Sarah was eventually diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. In Sarah's mind, she was not just Sarah. She was also Vanessa, Alice, Neela, and the nameless one. Alice was the weepy and vulnerable side of Sarah, while Vanessa was the strong, militant fighter inside her. Milo was feminine, polite, and liked to please people. But, of course, the saddest version of them was the nameless one, who took on all the consequences of the trauma and depression. When it came to Sarah's trial, her dissociative identity disorder was the main line of defense. She claimed that a girl named Alice wanted to take her own life, but the other personalities convinced her not to. After careful discussion among themselves, they decided that the only way out was to kill Hal. In a clearer and healthier world, Sarah's defense team argued that she was in a state of clinical dissociation when she committed her crime. The abuse Sarah endured while living with Hal is alarming. However, it was ultimately deemed irrelevant, as everything was consensual. From an investigative point of view, this was not compelling evidence. The defense itself also could not be persuasive, as the murder was clearly intentional. Unfortunately for Sarah, although her mental disorder was recognized as genuine, her defense failed to convince the judges, and she was ultimately found guilty of murdering Hal Sasko. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years. This greatly shocked both Sarah and her family. It became apparent that the abuse she had endured throughout her life and her mental state at the time of the murder were not taken into account when sentencing her, which means that her punishment was much harsher than she deserved. Sarah filed an appeal on the grounds that the abuse she suffered should have been considered during the trial. Unfortunately, by that time, more evidence of Hal's horrible behavior had been uncovered. After analyzing his computers, detectives found that they were literally riddled with illegal pornography. In addition, another woman, whose name remains unknown, claimed that Hal had preyed on both of her daughters. Given all this new evidence, Sarah's appeal resulted in a 50% reduction in her sentence to 25 years. To this day, she still remains behind bars, and that's because although the judge concluded that Hal did indeed abuse his control over Sarah, it doesn't negate the fact that she still committed premeditated murder. Sarah was initially a victim. Hal was a cruel manipulator of young women and did a very good job of deceiving many people in his community. However, some still remember him as an extremely generous person. Hal also had good sides. For example, he was known to have helped many employees get out of financial crises, and whenever someone needed advice, he was always ready to help. Hal's family does not deny his shameful actions but testifies to his positive character. He clearly needed help and did wrong, but he never deserved to die. Although Sarah's family agrees that she must be punished for her crimes, they also believe that the sentence was too harsh for someone trying to escape her abuser. Hal was undoubtedly a favorite of many people, but at the same time, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. This story is an example of how life circumstances, trauma, and a lack of proper support can lead to tragic consequences. Sarah became a victim of abuse by someone she trusted, and it caused irreparable damage to her mental health. However, this does not justify her actions. the deliberate murder of another human being. This story also demonstrates how important it is to be attentive to those around us and to be able to recognize warning signs. Perhaps if someone had intervened earlier, the tragedy could have been avoided. At the same time, this story raises questions about the fairness of the justice system. Was Sarah's punishment adequate given all the circumstances? Was her mental state and the trauma she suffered sufficiently taken into account? These questions remain open for discussion. Ultimately, this story serves as a reminder that a completely different personality can be hidden beneath the surface, shaped by life experiences and circumstances. Hiding behind a person's appearance, Harold, who many considered kind and generous, actually turned out to be a manipulator and a predator. This story prompts us to be careful in our judgments of others and to always remember that the truth can be much more complex than it appears. Minnie Lagerquist. On the night of Sunday, July 1, 1990, Nancy Lagerquist, an 87-year-old resident at Riverside Healthcare Center, was last seen alive at around 3:30 a.m. A care worker witnessed the elderly woman sound asleep in her bed. She was not distressed and appeared peaceful. The care worker closed her bedroom door and moved on to the next room. Nancy had been a resident at Riverside since December of 1988. Born in Hamilton, Montana, in 1902, she graduated high school at the age of 18 and spent much of her life working as an executive secretary. Nancy was an active member of the Missoula Business and Professional Women's Club. Prior to her retirement, she never married, had no children, and had little in the way of relatives at the time of her death. Those family members, a sister, 2 nieces, and 3 nephews, didn't live near the care home. By all accounts, Nancy lived an ordinary life. In the care home, she was unable to walk and so required around-the-clock assistance. There was nothing about her background to suggest there was a target on her back. At 4:30 a.m., 1 hour after Nancy was checked on at Riverside on July 1st, a worker checked on her room once more. This time, however, the alarm was raised. The 87-year-old was gone. The 5 employees on shift scattered across the building in an attempt to locate the elderly woman, but there was no sign of her. 11 minutes later, at 4:41 a.m., the police were alerted to Nancy's disappearance. Law enforcement promptly arrived on the scene, accompanied by search and rescue teams. They carried out an extensive search of the home and the surrounding area. The residence was located along the Clark Fork River, and boats manned by police officers were dispatched along the water. At 6:30 a.m., the search was called off. Authorities had found Nancy dead near the riverbank about 30 minutes downstream from Riverside. She had been murdered in a manner that was described by police as ritualistic. The circumstances of her death were violent, stemming from sexual assault with an object. Her body was then dumped into the water. To investigators working on the case, it soon became apparent that they would have their work cut out for them. The fact that Nancy's body had been put in the water had washed away any traces of forensic evidence, and her diaper has never been located. The police have never put forward a theory about the weapon used in the murder, and it, too, has never been found. Detectives soon theorized that the culprit had entered and exited through Nancy's bedroom window, which faced the river, as the screen had been cut. However, the perpetrator managed not to leave behind any evidence on the window or sill or in the rest of the bedroom. Furthermore, none of the alarms had gone off at any of the home's entrances, and all were in working order. It's unclear if the home was dusted for prints, but given the number of staff, residents, and guests coming and going from the home, it would have been a very arduous task if it had been done. The only lead in the case was a man seen by a member of staff at around 4 a.m. walking through the parking lot of the neighboring Missoula Athletic Club, away from the river and toward East Broadway Street. He was described as being white, between the ages of 30 and 40, and weighing around 180 to 200 pounds. He had light brown, collar-length hair, a mustache, and brown-rimmed glasses. He was wearing an untucked white and brown striped t-shirt, tan button front shorts, and white tennis shoes with white socks. His t-shirt was longer at the back than the front. This man was never considered a suspect but was wanted for questioning. Unclear if he ever made contact with the police or was even identified by them. Reportedly, the description led to the police becoming inundated with reports. Due to Nancy's minimal family ties, a family connection was quickly ruled out, after which the authorities turned their attention to staff members. Staff at the care home would be familiar with its layout and security measures, and would know who was best to target. Investigators felt that the murder could well be an inside job and homed in on one male staff member in particular. He was eventually cleared of being involved but left the care home less than a month later. It is unclear why he left. After ruling out the staff member, the police began to look at the possibility that the crime was the work of an outsider. They noted that security focused on the doors to the home, not the windows, and speculated that Nancy was picked because she was in a room facing the river and was not targeted for any reason more specific than that. They interviewed a man named James Bailey on multiple occasions but eventually dropped him as a suspect. Eventually, detectives looked back at the witness statements they had collected regarding any other potentially suspicious deaths in the home. One nurse had drawn their attention to the demise of an 86-year-old woman named Bara Scott, an Alzheimer's sufferer, who was discovered dead in her bed on May 2, 1990. She was put into restraints at night to stop her from wandering off, and because she'd suffered from heart disease, her death was assumed to be from natural causes. Neither the staff nor her family felt her demise was suspicious, except for the one nurse who had noted a bruise on Bara's neck. She was buried without an autopsy. Around the time of Bara's death, the care home staff had also noticed that there had been some tampering with the windows of the physical therapy room, although nothing ever really came of this. On the back of the nurse's comments, the police decided to exhume Bara's body and double-check her cause of death. Her family was shocked when the police announced that she had actually been raped before being strangled to death. Bara's life was rather different from Nancy's. She had been born in Pennsylvania in 1904 and was married 20 years later. She had moved to Missoula just 2 years before her death so that she could be closer to one of her surviving children. 4 of her 6 children had died before her, though she was succeeded by a vast number of grandchildren. During Bara's medical examination, it was discovered that DNA had been left behind. Although a sample was collected, it was too degraded to produce a DNA profile that would help the police find her killer. From here, both cases grew cold. In 1992, a man from another care home was arrested for sexually assaulting one of the residents. However, he was in prison at the time of the murders. The police also suspected Lloyd Chase Allen of being involved that same year, but he too was behind bars when the crimes were committed. In 2002, the Missoulian reported that several of the care home residents had spoken of a man who roamed the halls at night, but staff had never been sure if he was real or not because the residents' memories and testimonies were often unreliable. It's possible this man was real and that there are more cases like Bara's where residents were killed but deemed to have died from natural causes. However, without DNA evidence, a confession, or further investigation, it seems likely we will never see this case solved. Kaiser of Stops, Pretty Places, born on August 14, 2001, Kurups Pretty Places and her large family were members of various Native American reservations in Montana, including the Crow and North Cheyenne nations. An extremely athletic individual, Kurup was fond of basketball, football, running cross-country, and wrestling. In her teen years, she had performed in several plays at Hardin High School and participated in the school's choir. She had a big heart and was described as compassionate and loving by all those who knew her. She could often be found tending to stray animals in her spare time. But Kaiser's biggest ambition was to become a performer. She wanted to act and sing, and the future looked bright for the determined teen until her life was horrifically ripped away shortly after her 18th birthday. Kaiser was last seen on August 24, 2019, in Hardin, a rural town less than half a mile off the Crow Reservation, where she lived with her legal guardian and grandmother, Yolanda Frazier. It's unclear where the teen was aiming to go, but one thing is for certain: she never returned home. She had planned the following day to meet with her mother to visit North Dakota, but she failed to turn up for this get-together. Her family quickly noticed that their texts were going unanswered, their phone calls simply rang, and that Kaiser was not active on social media, which was perhaps the most telling clue of all that something was wrong. Later that day, Kaiser's aunt, Priscilla Bolali, went to report her niece missing to the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office but was told there was a mandatory waiting period before the report could be filed. This was later proven to be a lie. In Montana, anyone under the age of 21 is considered a minor, and that an Amber Alert should have been issued instead. It wasn't until August 27th that Kaiser's family was able to file the missing persons report. The police reportedly told Priscilla that the teen was probably out with her friends. There is no record that following her disappearance, law enforcement attempted to search for the teenager. They also didn't hand out flyers, which may have helped trace her final movements and prompt witnesses to step forward. Priscilla felt that because of Kaiser's troubled past and history of running away, law enforcement didn't take her case seriously. Although much of the 18-year-old's past remains a mystery to the public, it has been noted in recent articles that she had some issues with alcohol. In April of 2019, she was found unresponsive at school because she was heavily intoxicated, and she had to be rushed to the Then, on August 29th, a passing jogger discovered Kaiser's body by a wood pile in the backyard of a home at the intersection of Mitchell Avenue and Rangeview Drive in the Hardin suburb, where she was last seen alive 5 days earlier. The homeowner was out of town when her body was found and had no connection to the teenager. Kaiser's family were not notified immediately that a body had been found. Reports of a teenager's remains being discovered began circulating on social media, and the family caught wind of the rumors. They began to fear the worst. Priscilla went to the scene to ID the body but was turned away without being able to view the remains, and the local media were not alerted to the fact that a body had been found. Kaiser's mother, along with Yolanda, then went to the local morgue so they could view the body on September 1st, but they were informed that the body didn't belong to the missing teen, and so the family continued the search. It wasn't until 10 days later that it was revealed that the body was, in fact, Kaiser's. The coroner ruled that she had perished on August 26th and that her death was suspicious. Her remains were already badly decomposed, so the cause of death could not be determined. Asphyxiation could not be ruled out. Following this discovery, the teenager's family kept the pressure on law enforcement to investigate the death. On September 12th, Kaiser's mother, Garen, was told by Terry Bullis, the county coroner and the owner of Bullis Mortuary, that her daughter's remains had to be cremated in order to be returned to the family, despite the fact that this was against the family's cultural beliefs and would remove the possibility of further examinations of the body. Furthermore, the family had wanted the Dahl Funeral Home in Billings, Montana, to handle funeral arrangements, but Bullis made them use his business and ordered Kaiser's cremation before other family members could intervene. Members arrived in Hardin on September 14th. The family located the site where Kaiser's body was discovered with the help of relatives who lived nearby. They had attempted to visit the area a few days earlier but were unable to because the scene was no longer sealed off, and there was no demarcation of where the body was found. At the scene, they performed a ritual ceremony and noted that the area was very visible and had high traffic. A neighbor, Jason Cummings, who had found the body, told the family that the police had removed Kaiser's phone from her pockets and that he had told them to charge it so her family could be contacted. Although they appeared to ignore this suggestion, he, too, had questioned why the crime scene hadn't been sanctioned off to prevent contamination. 5 days later, on September 19th, the family alerted the media to the case. The Billings Gazette told them that they called the sheriff's office daily for any crime updates and hadn't been made aware of the case. That same day, Yander, along with Kaiser's father, Alan, went to meet up with Captain Mike Fuss of the Big Horn County Sheriff's Office. When they asked why Fuss had not made contact with the family or returned their calls, he told them he had been preoccupied with other cases. When they asked why the crime scene had not been sealed off, he explained that if investigators had arrived on the scene before uniformed officers, then they did not need to seal off the scene. According to Fuss, the scene was only sealed off if officers arrived first. Then Yolanda and Alan asked why law enforcement had not charged and turned on Kaiser's phone. Fuss was reportedly surprised that the family knew about this and said that the battery was dead, and so they didn't attempt to use it. Kaiser's family countered this by noting that they could have charged the phone and looked at her recent communications, but Fuss said they couldn't get into that phone and that not even the FBI could. Furthermore, Fuss implied that Kaiser had died from alcohol poisoning where she was found and seemed angry when the family told him they were offering a $5,000 reward for any information. He also revealed that the original investigator on the case, Jeremy Mydad, had stepped down because he couldn't handle it. Notably, Kaiser's family were not interviewed by law enforcement until this time. They also spoke with the Big Horn County attorney, Jay Harris, who told the family that the coroner, Terry Bullis, had a conflict of interest in his position as a funeral home business owner and the county medical examiner. Harris also noted that police tended to quickly determine the cause of death as exposure to alcohol and natural causes under his charge as coroner. However, Harris was otherwise reportedly brusque and rude towards the family and failed to provide them with clear answers to any of their questions, at one point telling them, "How do you know that nothing is being done?" On the 23rd, the family were notified that no missing persons report had been filed for Kaiser and that her name was not in the missing persons database. A week later, the FBI declined to take the case on, stating they needed more evidence that Kaiser was murdered on the reservation. Interestingly, just days before Kaiser vanished, she had filmed a video of several police officers beating her 15-year-old, wheelchair-bound brother and uploaded it to social media. The incident involved several deputies from the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office, leading to several officers being reprimanded. It is believed one of the officers who responded to the scene where Kaiser's body was found was one of those involved in the beating. This has sparked much speculation that the police were involved in her death or opted not to investigate in retaliation for Kaiser attempting to hold them responsible for their actions. In August of 2021, 2 years after the teenager's death, a fresh report revealed that 4 witnesses had been discovered. The statements of these individuals are not fully consistent, but generally describe a series of events which led to an argument outside of a home on Rangeview Drive at around 3 a.m. on August 26, 2019, involving Quera and 3 other unarmed individuals, including a 17-year-old girl, a 19-year-old woman, and a 23-year-old man. Some reports mentioned that Quera had been hanging out at the house and that an acquaintance had purchased alcohol for her. Reportedly, her blood alcohol level at the time of her demise was 0.149. The argument that had occurred that night led to another nearby homeowner setting off his car alarm, hoping it would cause the group to flee. They did, scattering in different directions. Quera was last seen heading towards the area where her body was later found. The news report also mentioned that no foreign DNA was discovered underneath her fingernails and that she had been diagnosed with asthma shortly before her disappearance. Kaiser's case is still unsolved. If you have any information about her disappearance and subsequent death, then you can contact the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office at 466-665, the case of Matthew Winkler, Secrets of a Religious Family. Sometimes the most horrible and unpredictable crimes are committed in seemingly perfect families. Of course, even in the most prosperous unit of society, crises can arise which go unnoticed by others, but literally poison the lives of all family members and eventually lead to tragedy. The Winklers, in the town of Selmer, were considered by many to be a model family. The young pastor, his wife, and their 3 daughters looked happy, had everything they needed for a comfortable life, and were healthy and successful. But in a quiet pool, as they say in this case, many questions remained unanswered because we heard only one version of what happened, and the story itself became the subject of the book Sex and Murder, Secrets of a Pastor. On March 22, 2006, the small town of Selmer, Tennessee, shook with terrible news. A 31-year-old pastor named Matthew Winkler was brutally murdered in his own home, and his wife, Mary, and their 3 daughters, 8-year-old Patricia, 6-year-old Maria Eliza, and 1-year-old Brianna, disappeared without a trace that day. The preacher of the Church of Christ did not show up for the evening service, where he was supposed to attend with his family. This circumstance seemed strange and suspicious because Matthew was always very responsible and could not miss the planned event without informing anyone. None of the family members also answered the phone, which was even more disturbing. Alarmed community members decided to go to the Winklers' residence to find out what had happened and if they needed help from the outside. The house looked normal, the windows and doors were intact, and nothing suspicious was visible inside. There were lights on in several rooms, and they could hear a television playing quite loudly in one of the rooms. It gave the impression that the owners of the house were busy doing their own thing. The front door was locked, but no one answered the knock. Phone calls also went unanswered, and through the curtained windows, it was impossible to see what was going on inside or if anyone was there. However, even though the whole situation was quite strange, no one was in a hurry to call the police. Instead, a call was made to an elder of the religious community, who advised them to look for a spare key and open the door themselves. It took another hour and a half, and when members of the community were finally able to get inside the house, they found an eerie scene. Everything in the house was in its place, there was no sign of intruders, but the owners were nowhere to be seen either. Everything seemed normal until the visitors looked into the marital bedroom. There, on the floor, in a pool of his own blood, lay the pastor's body. There was a huge hole in his back from a gunshot wound, blood spattered everywhere, and bloody foam dried on his face. By then, the body had already cooled and stiffened. It was obvious that Matthew had been lying there for many hours and had probably been killed in the morning because he was dressed in his pajamas. It was only after this that a call was made to the police. By the time the police arrived, a whole crowd of neighbors, churchgoers, and casual passers-by had gathered in and around the house, interested in what was going on. All of these people had left their fingerprints at the crime scene. They left their fingerprints and shoe prints, which erased or trampled possible evidence, greatly complicating the work of investigators. The police took the body for forensic examination and found that the pastor was killed by a single shot in the back fired from a large-caliber weapon. He died a few minutes after the wound from massive blood loss, unable to call for help. It was simply impossible to establish definitively whether there were any strangers in the house at that time because the people who had arrived before the police had literally destroyed all traces of them. The effect of the crime was quite strange, and those who could shed any light on what happened disappeared. The fate of the wife and daughters of the murdered man remained unknown. The police assumed that the woman and children could have been kidnapped or also killed. By the way, the family minivan, Winkler's, also disappeared from the garage. A massive search was launched, and the state issued a yellow alert. This meant that children were missing, and all citizens were asked to be vigilant and assist in the search. But let's break this whole story down from the beginning. Matthew Bryan Winkler was born on November 21, 1974, in the picturesque country town of Henderson, Tennessee, and was the youngest of 3 sons of Dan and Diane Winkler. Our hero and his 2 older brothers, James and Daniel, grew up in a rather conservative Christian family. Their parents were very religious and brought up their sons in strictness and obedience. It is worth noting that Matthew became a minister of the church in the 5th generation. His father, great-uncle Michael, grandfather Wendell, great-grandfather Merlin Winkler, and great-great-grandfather Merlin Paul Winkler Sr. were all preachers of the gospel at one time. To top it all off, the father ran the local preacher's school and was a respected and influential man in his hometown. In their younger years, the Winkler brothers attended Sunday school and were active in church activities. In addition, Matthew, in high school, was seriously interested in soccer, and everyone who saw his game on the field noted that he had talent and could well become an outstanding athlete of world renown. However, later the young man decided to sacrifice a promising sports career in favor of Bible study and church ministry. Since the preaching activity of the head of the family was associated with frequent travel, his wife and children almost always followed him. Because of this, Matthew changed several schools in his childhood, but the active, communicative, and friendly child quickly made friends and gained authority everywhere. When the boy finished school, his family lived in a small city called Austin, located in the state of Texas. Matthew was a creative person with powerful charisma, but his outstanding achievements in studies could not boast. After graduating from high school, he entered Freed-Hardeman College and successfully completed it. In parallel, the young man began to try his hand as a pastor under the careful guidance of his father. Matthew was the youth minister of the Central Church of Christ in the city of McMinnville. He was later appointed to the preaching position at the 4th Street Church of Christ in Selmer, Tennessee. Mary Carol Winkler, maiden name Freeman, was born in December 1973 in G Township, Tennessee, and was the oldest of 2 daughters to her parents. She was also raised in a deeply religious family with strict rules. The head of the family for many years served as a pastor in the Christian church where the girl attended Sunday school. A few years later, a second daughter was born to the family and named Patricia. Unfortunately, the girl was born prematurely and had a number of serious health problems, including cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and mental retardation. For many years, the parents did not want to put up with the disappointing diagnoses of the child and desperately tried to treat her, agreeing even to experimental therapy. However, it did not bring any particular improvement. Mary tenderly loved her little sister, always treated her with awe and cared for her as best she could. But in 1987, when 10-year-old Patricia was bathing in the bathtub, her older sister was only a minute away to take something from the bathing accessories. At that very moment, the girl had another epileptic seizure. When Mary returned to the room, her sister was no longer breathing, and all attempts to resuscitate her had come to nothing. For a 13-year-old girl, it was a huge shock and the first loss in her life. She blamed herself for the tragedy and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Teachers who saw the deplorable state of Mary sent her to the school psychologist. Working with him helped, but her father, learning about what was happening, made a scandal and forbade his daughter to go to these sessions, saying that such problems are discussed only within the family. In fact, the girl never received real moral support from her parents. Mary grew up modest and quite shy. She tried to avoid any conflicts, and after the tragic death of her little sister, she became withdrawn. Since her father did not allow her to seek help from a specialist, the trauma over the years resulted in serious psychological problems. After the death of Patricia, the parents decided to adopt a little girl named Charlotte, who was from a dysfunctional large family. Soon, the couple was also allowed to take custody of Charlotte's two brothers and sister, so the family was reunited in their new home. Mary was once again the older sister and took care of the younger children while helping her mother. Matthew and Mary Winkler, family life. The future spouses met soon after Matthew graduated from high school. The guy was prominent, handsome, athletic, and enjoyed great popularity with the opposite sex. However, to spin novels right and left, he did not allow a strict religious upbringing. The young people immediately developed a liking for each other, which quickly grew into love. For both of them, it was the first strong feeling in their lives. After a couple of months, they met each other's parents and, having received their blessing, began to plan a wedding. In April 1994, the lovers got married. When the family had an older daughter, Patricia, the head of the family, was still in college and was forced to leave school for a while. He took a job at a construction site, but did not last long there because he was not used to hard physical labor. During this period, for the first time, Matthew's difficult character made itself aware. He was often angry with others, irritated by small things, and sometimes he could not control his anger. But Mary tried not to complain and not to tell anyone about what was happening in her family. A meek young woman brought up in the spirit of patriarchy obeyed her husband in everything. At first, the Winklers lived near the house of Mary's parents, so she was able to see them regularly. But soon, Mrs. Freeman was diagnosed with cancer, which rapidly progressed, and in just a few months, she literally burned from the disease. It was another shock for Mary, and the care of her underage siblings now fell on her shoulders. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Mary was pregnant again at that time. But soon after the birth of their second daughter, the family moved to another city, where they bought their own small house. After the move, Mary was completely absorbed in the care of the baby and almost stopped communicating with her father, as well as with her younger brothers and sisters, who were too demanding and constantly needed attention. In addition, the young mother began to suffer from severe postpartum depression. Everyone who was closely acquainted with the Winkler family, some oddities were noted in the character and behavior of Mary. The young woman was characterized as an introvert and even a sociophobe. She did not communicate with anyone. It was difficult for her to make new acquaintances, much less friendships. She suffered from mood swings, was prone to melancholy, and any little thing could bring her to tears. While Matthew was building his career as a pastor, his wife became increasingly withdrawn. The situation became even more complicated when Mary once again became pregnant, and a few months later, she learned that the fetus had died in her womb. Such news strongly shook Mary, who was looking forward to the appearance of this child and very much dreamed of a large, friendly family. Again, she could only see the long-awaited two stripes on the pregnancy test 2 years later, and her happiness was unbounded. This time, Mary hid her pregnancy for a long time, as if afraid of something. She did so until her situation became obvious. Once again, everyone began to talk about Mary's strange behavior and pathological reticence, the strange behavior of Mrs. Winkler was associated not only with the severe psychological trauma she suffered in childhood but also with a very unhealthy environment within her own family, which only undermined her already unstable nervous system. The head of the family was a man of authority and demanded unconditional obedience. Despite the fact that, in public, the Winklers looked like an ideal married couple where there was trust, mutual respect, and harmony, in reality, their neighbors had repeatedly heard how the husband shouted and snapped at his wife for no apparent reason. No one could even imagine that a respected pastor could raise a hand on his wife until one day Mary had a huge black eye. Despite the fact that she denied the existence of domestic violence and said that it was an accident, rumors quickly spread about the cruelty of a young preacher who beat the mother of his children. In addition, Matthew, at some point, developed an irresistible urge to experiment in bed. He offered his wife to diversify their intimate life with role-playing games, adult toys, and so on. But for Mary, brought up in strictness with conservative views, such was unacceptable. She strongly restricted her husband in this, which infuriated him, and he repeatedly tried to get what he wanted by force. One day, after another abuse in bed, Mary called her only close friend in tears and complained to her about the situation. The friend, who promised to keep her secret, immediately blabbed about everything, which provoked a new wave of rumors and gossip about the unacceptable behavior of the clergyman. At that time, Matthew was up for promotion and aspired to be a local church leader, but he was rejected because of the rapidly spreading unpleasant rumors about him. Moreover, he was also removed from his position in the Sunday school, where he had brought God's word to the children and was in good standing. This was requested by the parents, who had also heard about the pastor's peculiar predilections. All this forced the family to leave their residence and move to another city, where they planned to start over. They settled in Selmer, where they quickly gained the love and respect of those around them. Matthew took a job as a church pastor again, and his wife found a part-time job to make a small contribution to the family income. Although the family was still not smooth, their neighbors, as well as the congregation of the church where Matthew preached, considered Mary and Matthew an ideal couple and their family a model. Next door to the Winkler family lived a young married couple, with whom the couple quickly became friends. They often visited each other, celebrated holidays together, and shared news and secrets a few months before the tragedy. During a joint dinner at the pastor's house, Mary bragged to the neighbors that her husband had bought her a gun for self-defense and had already taken her to the shooting range several times to learn how to handle it confidently. Mary turned out to be quite a capable student, quickly mastering all the subtleties and accurately shooting at targets. Moreover, it turned out that the Winklers already had firearms in the house, which had been purchased by the pastor earlier also for self-defense. The guests wondered why the pastor and his wife needed all this, considering they lived in a quiet town where they had no enemies and everyone around them loved and respected their family. After another move, the couple's financial situation left much to be desired. Mary was in search of various part-time jobs, and she also decided to get a medical degree to help them get a job in a clinic and assist sick children. Soon, Mary decided to improve the financial condition of their family through financial fraud. She later claimed that she did not realize she was doing something illegal and was going to pay back all the money as soon as she got back on her feet. What Mary was doing is commonly referred to as artificially inflating account balances. Mrs. Winkler also received checks from unspecified sources and then deposited them into a bank account she and her husband owned. She then changed the address of the account so that all communications would be routed there. The total amount of checks she received was almost $177,000, which aroused certain suspicions among the bank employees, who decided to invite the couple to the office branch to clarify the circumstances and resolve the situation. However, the pastor and his wife never showed up at the bank, which aroused even more suspicion. It was assumed that Matthew was not aware of what his wife was doing at all. However, after Matthew's death, his wife tried to prove in court that the whole story of fraud was his idea and that he was the one who forced her to make dubious transactions while he himself remained in the shadows, without arousing suspicion. Where had Mary disappeared to? When Mr. Winkler was found murdered in his own home, his wife and daughters were put on the wanted list, fearing that they too might be in mortal danger. Initially, the meek, shy, and homely Mary was viewed solely as a possible victim of the crime. However, After talking to neighbors and receiving information from the bank about financial fraud, she became the main suspect in the murder of her own husband. It was necessary to find out as soon as possible where Mary had disappeared to, where the children were, and if they were all right. They, as well as their family car, were put on the wanted list. Attempts were also made to trace transactions made from Mary's bank card and to locate her through her cell phone signal. Mary was found just a day later in an Alabama resort town, where she and her children were having fun at a local amusement park. It was as if the mother wanted to give her children one last party, realizing that she would soon be going to prison and would not see her girls for a long time. When the family was taken to the police station to testify, the two older daughters confidently told the same story. According to them, intruders had broken into the house and injured their dad, and their mom picked up a gun to protect them. They were then forced to run for their lives. According to the girls, their father was alive and in the hospital, and they were soon to go and see him and return home. What exactly happened in the house? As it turned out, Patricia and Maria Eliza did not see and learned about the events from the words of their mother. They only heard a gunshot and glimpsed their father lying on the floor, and then their mother put them in the car, and they drove away. Mary almost immediately began to confess, but she claimed that she could not reconstruct the entire chain of events of that day, referring to a temporary blur. According to her, her spouse had abused her for years, humiliating her and inducing her to forms of intimacy that were unacceptable to her. Mary insisted that it was he who had initiated the financial scam she had perpetrated. Matthew demanded total obedience, easily lost his temper, and once gave in to the will of his fists. This was confirmed by Matthew's secretary at his previous place of employment. The woman repeatedly witnessed how the pastor insulted his wife, who carefully brought him lunch to church, but he was always dissatisfied with something. The evening before the tragedy, there was another scandal in the family, because of which the spouses went to bed in separate rooms. Mary cried all night, and in the morning, she did not realize how she had a shotgun in her hands, which her husband kept loaded. She entered Matthew's room and shot him in the back while he was still lying in bed. Matthew collapsed to the floor, bloody foam oozing from his mouth and nose. According to Mary, her husband, while still alive, whispered, "Why?" To which she replied, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Mary then took her daughters and left the house. Experts have established that her husband tried to reach for the phone to call for help, but he no longer had the strength to do so. By the way, the weapon of the crime was found in the trunk of the car on which Mary left with the children. For what purpose she took it with her, Mrs. Winkler also could not answer at the trial. The role-playing costumes found in their home were presented as evidence of the pastor's humiliation and moral abuse of his wife. Upon seeing them, Mary turned pale and then became hysterical. Despite the fact that she contradicted her testimony and told several different versions of what happened, the court agreed that she was the victim of a domestic tyrant and that the murder was the result of years of anger, resentment, and pain. However, this did not absolve Mary of responsibility for what she had done. In April 2007, the court delivered its final verdict in this complicated and confusing case. Mrs. Winkler was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but her mental state raised many questions. It was originally expected that the young woman would be sent to prison for at least 6 years, but in the end, she was given a sentence of less than 1 year. She spent 2 months of that sentence in a psychiatric hospital, where experts were trying to determine whether she could regain custody of her children. Upon release in the summer of 2008, Mary was given sole custody of her daughters, who all this time lived with their paternal grandparents. Matthew's parents were extremely upset by this circumstance. They believed that their daughter-in-law had deliberately killed their son and suffered virtually no punishment for it. Now their granddaughters were given full custody of her. However, all their numerous attempts to file appeals had failed. As for the fraud case, it never went to trial. The bank never filed formal charges, and the whole story was dropped.